I never imagined I would be the one to utter those words, let alone reveal the truth that had been festering inside me for years. Sitting alone in the dim confines of the confession booth, my hands were clammy, trembling as I gripped the wooden partition. The air felt thick, suffocating, yet I knew I had reached the point of no return. My voice, hoarse and shivering, broke the silence as I finally confessed, "Father, I've killed him." The words came out like a forced exhalation, heavy with guilt and desperation. I saw the ripple of shock flash across the priest's face through the small crack, but I pressed on, voice cracking. It was him, the man who confessed to abusing that child from the choir. A cold rush of adrenaline shot through me as the memory resurfaced, how it had started, the rumors, the whispers that I had tried to ignore. I remembered the moment when he had broken down, trembling, his eyes filled with remorse as he confessed everything, how he'd hurt that innocent kid. I had listened, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of it all. But then the darkness in me had stirred. I couldn't bear the thought of him walking free, of him hurting others again. Rage had consumed me, blinding me as I took matters into my own hands. "I found him," I whispered, voice trembling. "I cornered him near the old barn. He begged, pleaded. I saw the fear in his eyes, and I lost control." I paused, blinking away the tears that threatened to betray my resolve. I strangled him with my bare hands. I didn't want to, but I couldn't let him hurt anyone else. I'd rather take justice into my own hands, even if it meant destroying myself. There was a silence so thick I could hear the faint echo of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I could feel the priest's gaze, heavy and searching, trying to decipher whether I was telling the truth or simply cracked beyond salvation. My mind spiraled, recalling the moment I'd buried the body in the woods, covering my tracks with trembling fingers. I'd watched his face twist in pain and terror as I pressed him to the ground, the blood and sweat, the sickening realization that I'd crossed an unforgivable line. "I know what I did was wrong," I whispered, voice cracking. But I couldn't let him continue. Not after what he confessed. I swore I'd protect those children. I swore I'd do something. And I did. I've carried this weight for years. Night after night, the screams echoing in my mind, the shame gnawing at my soul. I thought I could forget, but it's haunted me. It's consumed me. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my trembling hands. I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness. I came to confess, to finally unburden myself, to face what I've done before I lose my soul entirely. My voice faltered, and I looked away, shame flooding through me. I knew I'd be judged, but I also knew I couldn't keep hiding behind my robes, pretending I was pure when I had murdered a man. A man who was a monster, yes, but still a man. I've killed him, and now I'm just waiting for you to decide what comes next. The silence stretched long and unforgiving, and I felt the weight of eternity pressing down on me. I had revealed my darkest deed, and there was no turning back. The walls seemed to close in, the confession burning into my skin like a second skin, sealing my fate. I clenched my fists, my heart pounding so fiercely I feared it might burst out of my chest. I had told the truth at last, and somehow, despite everything, I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. The moment of life or death. My hands are slick with sweat as I sit here, the muffled chime of the church bell echoing softly through the silence. It's as if the world outside continues obliviously, but inside my mind races, replaying the moment I decided to face my own shadow. I clutch my palms together, trying to steady the tremor that refuses to subside, knowing full well that these trembling fingers carry the weight of 1,000 sins. The candle flickers beside me, casting elongated shadows on the stone walls, a silent witness to my confession. I close my eyes briefly, inhaling deeply, trying to summon some semblance of composure. Still my thoughts spiral back to that fateful day, to the terrible choice I made, the line I crossed that can never be uncrossed. I remember the sensation of cold metal in my hand, the hurried rush of adrenaline, and the sickening realization that I had become the monster I once feared. The man before me, his eyes wide with horror, pleading, begging, was no hero. I knew he was a predator, a corrupter of innocence. His confession had shattered me, and I had felt rage swell within, an uncontrollable tide that masked my fear, my shame, my desperate need to protect the children I swore to guard. And so, I acted. I ended his life. It was not a moment I planned, but one I felt driven to by an unyielding necessity. Justice, I told myself. A twisted form of justice, perhaps, but justice nonetheless. I saw his face in my mind's eye now, haunted, accusatory. And I wonder if he saw the same in mine in that dark, awful instant. Did he understand that I had become the very thing I despised? That I had relinquished my humanity to stop a greater evil? My hands fidget nervously, remembering the blood that stained my skin, the silent scream of my conscience echoing in the chambers of my heart. I had thought I could bury it, that time would dull the pain, but it only festered. The guilt grew in the corners of my mind, a persistent, gnawing presence that demanded to be acknowledged. I told myself I was a protector, a servant of divine justice. But now I see how thin that line truly is, how close I came to losing myself entirely. The church bell's chime interrupts my reverie, and I open my eyes, seeing the flickering flame dance in rhythm with my racing thoughts. I know I'm nearing the moment of reckoning. The truth has been spoken, the confession made. There's no turning back from this point. My soul hangs in the balance, trembling on the edge of salvation or damnation. I think about the faces of the children, the innocent lives I swore to shield. Their images flash vividly, small hands clutching rosaries, innocent eyes staring up at me with trust. Did I betray that trust when I took that man's life? Or was I finally doing what I believed was right? I grapple with this question, knowing the answer will forever remain shrouded in the darkness of my soul. As I sit there, trembling, I realize that this moment, this raw, brutal honesty, is my attempt at redemption, to face the monstrous deeds I've committed, to accept their weight and perhaps find some peace. I am a priest, a man of faith, yet I have been living in the shadows of my own making. Today I shed those shadows, exposing my deepest, most shameful truths. The silence around me feels deafening, yet strangely, I sense a strange calm washing over me, a cold serenity born of acceptance. I have faced the abyss and spoken the words I could no longer keep hidden. Whatever punishment awaits, I know I cannot escape it. I am forever marked by what I have done. But maybe, just maybe, in this confession, I have taken the first step toward forgiving myself. I take one last deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs, and prepare myself for whatever comes next. The church bell continues its slow, deliberate toll, a reminder that time marches on, that life goes on beyond our darkest moments. I am ready to face that, to accept whatever judgment or mercy the universe offers me now. Because in this moment of truth I finally feel free. Perhaps the only true redemption I will ever find is in owning my darkness, in refusing to hide from the shadows that have haunted me for so long. In that dim, musty confession booth, I felt my pulse race, each beat pounding loud in my ears. The flickering candlelight cast long wavering shadows on the wood-paneled walls, mirroring the tumult raging within me. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to steady my trembling hands, acutely aware of the fragile silence that enveloped us. The only sounds were the faint, ragged breaths of Miguel Silva, whose voice trembled as he admitted, with tears streaming down his face, that he had abused a child from the choir. His words hit me like a blow. I could feel my stomach tighten, a mixture of disgust, pity, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. How could he, a man I once saw as vulnerable and broken, sink so low? Yet as the confession spilled out, I realized that beneath that veneer of horror lay a truth I could no longer ignore. I had to confront it, face the darkness that lurked in the corners of my own soul. I remember how my voice wavered as I responded, trying to mask my shock with a calm I did not genuinely feel. "Miguel," I said softly, almost in a whisper, "you have committed a grave sin. Your darkness is laid bare, and now the weight of it bears down on us both." I was painfully aware of the moral abyss I was about to step into, knowing that my decision would change everything, perhaps irreparably. As I listened, my mind raced with conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to condemn him outright, to cast him away into the shadows where he belonged in my eyes. But another, deeper part felt a strange, twisted sense of duty. Justice demanded action, yes, but compassion also called for truth and understanding. Could I save him? Or was I merely deluding myself, trying to find redemption in his confession? The room grew colder as I leaned in slightly, voice barely above a whisper. "You are a broken man, Miguel. What you have done is unforgivable, yet I see a man lost in the darkness crying out for help." My words felt hollow, even as they left my lips. I knew that by listening, I was crossing a line I could never fully return from. I was no longer just a priest hearing confession. I was a witness to human depravity and to my own moral dilemma. My mind flashed back to the vows I took, the sacred promises I made to serve justice and mercy. Yet here I was, contemplating a path that blurred those lines. I wondered if I was acting out of righteousness, or simply succumbing to the temptation of owning my own darkness, owning the shadow that had haunted me for years. Ever since I first encountered evil in its raw, unfiltered form, I hesitated, my throat tightening, unsure if what I was about to do was salvation or damnation. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I felt the weight of the universe pressing down, demanding a decision. Do I report this? Do I confront him with the full force of the law? Or do I accept this confession as a sign that perhaps mercy, in its most uncompromising form, resides in confronting the truth, no matter how heinous? In that moment, I saw my own reflection flicker in Miguel's tear-filled eyes, a mirror of my own guilt, my own sins. I had to choose. To turn him in might bring justice, but it might also destroy what fragile hope remained within him. To keep silent could make me a complicity in silence, an accomplice to evil. Neither choice felt right, only unavoidable. I knew I was teetering on the precipice of moral collapse. My hands, once steady in prayer, now trembled with the weight of impending judgment. I felt a strange sense of clarity, an understanding that owning this darkness was perhaps the only path toward true redemption. Not through denial, but through acknowledging the abyss, standing face to face with the shadows I had long tried to ignore. As I finally made my decision, my voice barely a whisper, I felt a strange calm settle over me. "Miguel," I said, voice thick with emotion, "you must face the consequences of your actions. Justice must be served, and I will do what I can to guide you through this darkness, even if it consumes us both." I knew that this moment would haunt me forever, that the lines between right and wrong had blurred into a muddy path I would walk for the rest of my days. I stepped back, the confession still echoing in my mind, a haunting refrain I would carry with me. The candle flickered one last time, its flame trembling, as if mirroring the fragile, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, in owning the truth, I could find some semblance of peace, an uneasy reconciliation between my faith and the monstrous reality I had witnessed. And as I exited that confessional, I realized that I no longer carried only my sins, but a burden shared, one of justice, mercy, and the unshakable truth that sometimes the greatest act of faith is confronting the darkness within ourselves and others, no matter how deeply it scars. The confession hung in the stale air of the confessional booth, thick with the weight of my own secrets. I could feel the tremor in my voice, each word a struggle, yet a necessity I could no longer deny. As I uttered the truth, my truth, I saw the flicker of horror in Miguel's eyes, a mirror reflecting the darkness I had allowed myself to entertain for too long. His shame was palpable, a bitter taste that clung to the back of my throat. But beneath that shame I sensed something more volatile, an undercurrent of anger, simmering just beneath the surface. I watched him squirm, the shame washing over him like a tide, and a part of me wanted to absolve him, to reach through that confessional window and offer some fleeting mercy. But I knew better. I knew that honesty demanded sacrifice, that justice was a blade that cut both ways, and as I looked into his trembling face I felt it, the surge of my own restraint, a controlled fury that I had to contain, lest I lose myself entirely. My hands clenched into fists, trembling with the effort to keep my composure. My mind raced with memories, every detail of the confession I had heard days before, every moment of shame that had haunted me since. The boy's terrified eyes, the broken voice that admitted to heinous acts, these images refused to fade. And yet, here I stood, about to carry out a different kind of justice, one that would condemn or release in equal measure. There was a strange clarity in my mind, an understanding that this burden was mine now. That silence would have been a betrayal, and concealment an act of cowardice. The darkness I was wrestling with was no longer external. It had rooted itself deep within my soul, and confronting it required a brutal honesty I was only beginning to comprehend. I told Miguel that he would face the consequences, an echo of my own internal struggle, of the moral labyrinth I was navigating. The silence after my words felt deafening. I could see the tremor in his shoulders, the rapid flickering of his eyes as he processed the weight of my confession. I wanted to reach out, to shake him, to scream that justice had to be served. Yet I knew that no words could undo what had transpired. My decision had been made, and now I was bound to it, no matter how much it tore at the fabric of my faith. A strange calm descended over me then, a hollow serenity born from surrender. I realized that by speaking, I was not just exposing his sins, but exposing my own. My complicity in a world riddled with darkness, my failure to act sooner, my silence that had allowed evil to fester. The line between the sinner and the saint blurred, and I understood that perhaps true redemption lay in owning the darkness, not denying it. As I stepped back from the confessional, my ears still echoed with the sound of my own voice, the finality of the truth. I felt the flickering candle's flame dance with a fragile life, much like my own fragile hope. Could I find peace in this revelation? Could I reconcile my faith with the monstrous truths I had uncovered? I didn't know. All I knew was that I had crossed a point of no return, that I bore the weight of justice and mercy intertwined in a single burden. And then amidst that storm of conflicting emotions, I realized something startling, that I was no longer merely an observer, but an active participant in this moral upheaval. The darkness within me, once hidden behind the guise of righteousness, now threatened to consume what little remains of my innocence. I felt the rage, raw, restrained, simmering beneath the surface. It was a fire that threatened to ignite. Fueled by the betrayal of trust, the innocence shattered, and the lies that had been woven into my faith. My fists clenched tighter, my knuckles white with the effort of holding back. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay silent, even as the fury threatened to burst forth. I had entered this confession seeking clarity, seeking absolution, but what I found was a tumult of unwanted truths about myself, about Miguel, about the world we inhabit. I saw through the veneer of sanctity I once clung to and recognized the raw, brutal reality that evil cloaked itself in familiar faces, in the sacred rituals I believed in. The anger grew, a slow kindling in my chest, and I knew it could not be ignored. It demanded acknowledgement, an outlet. Yet I held it down, pressing it deep into the marrow of my bones, because I understood that this wasn't just about punishing Miguel, nor simply about exposing his sins. It was about confronting the very core of my convictions, about facing the inconvenient truth that sometimes justice required sacrifice, sacrifice that might cost me my faith, my peace, or even my soul. As I finally stepped away from the confessional, I felt the cold resolve settle into me. I was no longer the same man who entered seeking answers. I was changed, scarred, hardened. The darkness I had feared had seeped into my marrow, and I realized that the path ahead was now one of difficult redemption, one where anger and mercy would battle within me, where silence was no longer an option, and where the truth, no matter how ugly, had to be faced. As the last words left my mouth, I felt a strange stillness settle over me, as if the chamber itself exhaled in relief, or perhaps in despair. I looked down, my hands trembling more visibly now, and I could see the tremor ripple through my fingers like a reflection of the tumult I'd kept buried inside. I had carried this burden for so long that uttering it aloud felt like ripping open a wound I had tried to seal with faith and denial. I hesitated, my voice barely a whisper, but the truth was raw and unshielded. I confessed, not just the act itself, but the guilt that had gnawed at my core for years, anchoring itself deep within my bones. I revealed that I had been the one who had taken that man's life. The confession spilled from me in fragments, a desperate attempt to unburden my soul, to free myself from the weight of what I'd done, and what I had hidden all these years. The man's eyes widened in horror, his face draining of color, and I saw the shock ripple across his features as I laid bare my darkest deed. I knew immediately that I was shattering whatever fragile illusion of sanctity remained in this sacred space. My voice grew softer, trembling, as I continued detailing the steps I took, the silent nights haunted by his face, by the screams I could never unhear. I felt the blood pounding in my temples, each word pushing me closer to the precipice of madness or salvation. In that confessional, I was stripped of all pretense. I had expected judgment, condemnation, perhaps even forgiveness. Yet what I felt was an odd calm, a hollow emptiness that echoed the chaos within. As I finished, I looked away, unable to meet his gaze, knowing I had just cast a stone into the still waters of my own conscience. The silence stretched between us, thick and oppressive, like the quiet before a storm. I struggled to breathe, to steady the trembling in my voice, knowing that from this moment forward, I would never be able to unsee what I'd revealed. My heart pounded with the terror of exposure, of losing whatever semblance of innocence I had left. I wondered if this act of confession, this surrender, would set me free or condemn me forever. A part of me wanted to run, to flee the weight of that truth, but I sat rooted, knowing that silence would no longer serve me. The darkness I had hidden inside was now exposed to the light, swirling and twisting like a storm. The choice was mine, to let it destroy me or to accept it as part of my battered, broken soul. Yet, even as I grappled with the aftermath, I realized that I had crossed a line, one from which I could never return. My guilt was no longer a secret kept in shadows. It was woven into the very fabric of who I was. In the quiet aftermath, I felt the cold grip of reality tighten around me, and I knew that my path to redemption, if it existed at all, would be paved with more pain and sacrifice. But for now I had spoken, and there was no undoing it. The truth was out, and I could only hope that somehow, in reckoning with it, I might find a glimpse of forgiveness, even if that forgiveness was only for myself. I hesitated, my hands trembling as I finally found the courage to speak, my voice barely more than a whisper in the oppressive silence of the confession chamber. The candle flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across my face, illuminating the torment etched into my features. Every word felt like a stone dropping into the still waters of my conscience, sending ripples that threatened to drown me in their weight. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to look up, to meet the man's horrified eyes. His face was pale, eyes wide with shock and disbelief, as if I had just revealed a ghost from his worst nightmares. But I couldn't hold it back any longer. The truth, long buried beneath layers of shame and denial, clawed its way out of my throat. Years ago, I began, my voice trembling fiercely. I committed an act of violence, a terrible act I tried to forget, to lock away where I thought it couldn't hurt me anymore. I paused, the words catching in my throat, choking me with their weight. I hurt someone, a young boy, when I was still a boy myself. The confession spilled forth in a rush, like a dam breaking after years of relentless pressure. I saw the shock ripple across his face, the way his jaw clenched, and I knew I was shattering his perception of me. A lifetime of secrets unfastened from their anchors, swirling into the cold air of that lonely room. I saw his eyes flicker with horror, with anger, perhaps even with betrayal, and yet, despite the overwhelming urge to recoil, I pressed on. I carried that darkness inside me, hiding it from everyone, including myself, for so long. I convinced myself that it was somehow justified, that I could bury it deep enough that it wouldn't haunt me. But I was wrong. Every attempt to forget only made it worse, festering in the shadows of my mind, poisoning everything I touched. The words tasted bitter, like ash on my tongue. I could feel the tremor in my voice, the tremor of a soul teetering on the brink of ruin. My confession was not an act of redemption, I knew, more like an admission of guilt that would stain me forever, a mark I could never wash away. Yet I understood that silence would serve no purpose anymore. The truth was out, released into the cold air, and with it came a suffocating sense of inevitability. The silence stretched again, thick and suffocating, as I waited for his reaction. I wondered for a moment if he would call for justice, or if he would condemn me to the shadows I had so long kept hidden. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, each beat a reminder that I had crossed a line from which I could never return, that I had become in some ways the monster I once feared. The room felt colder now, as if the very walls had absorbed my confession and were curling inward in judgment. I felt exposed, raw and vulnerable, stripped of the masks I had used to shield myself. The weight of what I had revealed pressed down on me, heavy as lead, threatening to crush what's left of my fractured soul. Yet, amidst the chaos, a strange calm settled, a strange clarity even. I realized that confronting this darkness, bringing it into the light, was perhaps the only path forward. Not toward forgiveness necessarily, but toward understanding, my own at least. I had carried this secret for so long, convinced that it was a burden I alone bore. Now I saw that hiding it only deepened my suffering. I had chosen to speak, to unburden myself, knowing full well the price I might pay. There would be consequences, consequences I might never fully reckon with. Perhaps I would be cast out, shunned, or judged harshly by those around me. Or maybe, just maybe, I would find a shred of peace, a fragment of redemption in finally acknowledging my darkest deed. As I sat there, trembling, I felt the cold truth settle into my bones like an inescapable shadow. I understood that I was no longer the same man who had entered that room. I had exposed my scars, and in doing so I had become painfully aware of the depth of my own brokenness. Yet, in that vulnerability, I also glimpsed a sliver of something else, an ember of hope that somehow, embracing my truth might be the first step toward true repentance. The silence persisted, heavy and oppressive. I knew that the road ahead would be long, filled with pain and regret, but I was no longer afraid of facing it. I had spoken. I had revealed my darkness. And now I could only hope that someday, somehow, I might find a way to forgive myself, or at least learn to live with the ghost of what I had done. I watched Miguel's face transform as the weight of my confession sank into him. His eyes, once steady and calm, flickered with a tumult of emotion, hope, fear, and something darker I couldn't quite read. It was as if I had reached deep into his soul and stirred a mirror reflecting my own fractured conscience. I sensed that my words had shattered something within him. But I also saw a flicker of understanding, perhaps even a shadow of empathy. I took a slow breath, feeling my chest tighten under the burden of what I had just admitted. My voice had trembled, each word a fragile piece of my truth, falling between us like shards of broken glass. I knew that in confessing, I had opened a door that could never be closed again, and I wondered if I had made a mistake, or if I had finally done what I needed to do to face myself. Miguel's expression flickered as he processed what I'd just revealed. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something but found himself powerless. His gaze darted away for a moment, then back to me, searching for answers that perhaps I couldn't give. I could feel the air thickening around us, heavy with unspoken fears and unacknowledged truths. The silence stretched long and taut, like a wound that refused to heal. In that silence, I felt my mind spiraling. I remembered how I'd carried this secret for so many years, how I had convinced myself that silence would somehow protect me or diminish the horror of what I had done. But the truth has a way of clawing its way out, no matter how tightly you try to seal it away. Now in this dimly lit room, I had finally let it escape. There was no turning back from this point. Miguel's expression shifted again, his brow furrowing, his jaw tightening as if he was battling himself. I saw the struggle inside him, a tumult of conflicting feelings. Hope flickered briefly in his eyes, perhaps that faint hope that someone like me, could ever seek redemption or understanding. But beneath that, I sensed the fear that this confession might unleash chaos, that the darkness I had revealed could engulf us both. I reached out instinctively, my hand trembling as I touched his arm. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him that I understood the gravity of what I'd done, that I didn't expect forgiveness or absolution. I only needed him to see the truth, not to excuse it but to acknowledge it, because in that acknowledgement I believed lay the possibility of confronting the consequences and perhaps, in some distant corner of my conscience, finding a sliver of peace. His eyes locked onto mine, searching for some sign of remorse, some plea for mercy. I saw pain there, raw and unfiltered. It was a pain I recognized because I had felt it myself for so long. But amidst that pain I also saw something else, an ember of understanding, fragile yet persistent. It was as if he was trying to grasp the idea that my confession was not a plea for forgiveness, but a desperate act of honesty, a cry into the darkness that had haunted me all these years. The room seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing longer as we sat in silence. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a quiet acceptance of what I had just revealed. My mind raced with memories, doubts, and hopes. I knew that this moment would define me, would forever mark my path, whether I was condemned or understood. I had spoken, and in that act, I had taken ownership of my darkness. There was no undoing it now, and yet a faint flicker of hope persisted. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something, of a reckoning, of a way to live with what I had done. Maybe I could carry this burden without letting it destroy what little pieces of myself remained. Or perhaps I would be forever haunted by the ghost of that terrible truth. Either way, I knew I had crossed a point of no return. In the depths of that silent understanding between us, I realized that the real journey was just beginning. Facing the darkness inside me was only the first step. Now I would have to confront whatever came next: judgment, forgiveness, or perhaps just the cold, unyielding truth of my own soul. But for now, all I could do was sit there, vulnerable and exposed, waiting to see what dawn might bring. I hesitated, my hands trembling as I confessed beneath the flickering candlelight, each word feeling like a blade slicing through the fragile veneer of my composure. The room seemed to press in around me, the air thick with the weight of my truth, and I could see the horror widening in his eyes, an expression I knew all too well from the mirror of my own soul. Yet, despite the trembling, despite the fear gnawing at my insides, I pushed forward, driven by a force I couldn't fully understand, perhaps a desperate need for absolution or a twisted form of justice inside me. The confession spilled out, raw and unfiltered, a torrent of the darkest parts I had long tried to bury. I spoke of the boy in the choir, of the nights I'd whispered promises I knew would never be kept, of the shame that had corroded my heart for years. Each word felt like a sacrilege, yet also a liberation. I watched as his face twisted in horror, a mixture of disbelief and revulsion, but I knew I couldn't stop. My mouth refused to shut, my voice a broken cry in the silence. In that instant I felt a strange, paradoxical sensation, an eerie calm settling over me, as if the storm inside had reached some fragile equilibrium. It was as if by exposing my darkness, I had somehow rendered it less powerful, less capable of destroying me. But beneath that calm I sensed something darker lurking, an abyss of guilt and remorse that threatened to swallow me whole. I was caught betwixt two worlds, the desire for forgiveness and the hunger for punishment. Both beckoned with equal ferocity. My gaze bore into his, searching for something, any sign of mercy, understanding, or perhaps just the acknowledgement that I was no longer hiding. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears, each beat echoing the chaos in my mind. I wondered if he could see the truth in my eyes, the truth I had long concealed behind piety and silence. Would he condemn me? Could I even condemn myself? The lines blurred, and I wondered if there was a difference anymore. The silence grew thick and suffocating. I saw the flicker of emotion, or was it horror, cross his face, and I realized that I had unveiled a part of myself that could never be reclaimed, never excised. My words hung in the air, an unholy relic laid bare. I braced for whatever judgment would follow, knowing that the act of confession had forever altered the fabric of my soul. In that moment, I felt the cold truth tighten around me like a noose. I had crossed a boundary, stepped into a darkness that I could never fully escape. The shame, the guilt, the shame again, they all danced in a twisted ballet around my heart. I knew I had become something I once despised, something I swore I'd never be, and yet I also knew that silence would no longer serve me. To carry this burden alone was a death sentence. As I stared at him, I understood that this was not just a confession. It was a reckoning, a final acknowledgement of my sins. I felt a strange clarity, a hollow sense of peace that came from laying bare my worst. But peace was fleeting, and I could sense the storm that would inevitably follow. Judgment, obsession, the possibility of redemption or eternal damnation. Whatever came, I had committed myself to this path, to face the consequences of what I had revealed. My hands, once trembling, now felt like stones in my lap. I clenched my fists as the storm inside threatened to break free, and I knew that I had taken a step into a darkness I could never fully escape. There was no turning back now. Once the truth was out, I was forever changed, marked by my own confession, forever haunted by the shadows I had dared to unveil. In the quiet aftermath, I waited for the next words, for the judgment, for the reckoning. I sat there, exposed, vulnerable, knowing that I had just begun a journey into the depths of my own soul. The room seemed colder, darker, as if the very walls mourned what I had done. Yet amidst all the turmoil, a strange, unsettling sense of liberation persisted. I had finally spoken. I had finally owned my darkness. And now there was no turning back. A tumult roared within me, an unrelenting storm that refused to abate. My mind spun with conflicting thoughts. Protect the boy, the innocent child whose trembling face haunted me. Report the confession, exposing the darkness that had festered beneath the surface. Or follow a twisted sense of justice that only I could serve, a vigilante retribution that might forever stain my soul. Each option felt like a razor's edge, cutting into my conscience with relentless precision. I hesitated, my hands trembling anew as I recalled the man's widened eyes, the shock and horror that flickered across his face when I finally confronted him. I saw his face in my mind's eye, the way his lips trembled, the sweat that beaded on his brow as if his own guilt was already tearing him apart. But what of the boy who had endured so much, who still carried scars unseen? Did I have the right to act on my own, to decide his fate when I knew I was already marked by the secrets I kept? A voice inside me, cold and unyielding, whispered that silence was no longer an option, that by hiding the truth, I was complicit in the long, dark chain of suffering. Yet another part of me, weak, trembling, clung desperately to the hope that my actions could somehow be justified, that I could shield the boy from the storm my choices might unleash. It was a fragile hope, fragile as glass, ready to shatter at any moment. I clenched my fists, the knuckles stark white, as the weight of my decision pressed down. My heart hammered like a drum in my chest, each beat a reminder of the gravity of what I was about to do. The confession had peeled back layers of my own shame, exposing raw, vulnerable truths. But now I faced an even greater test. What path to take when the lines between right and wrong blurred beyond recognition? Memories flickered like ghostly shadows, images of the boy, his eyes wide with innocence, his trembling voice begging for mercy. I felt a surge of protectiveness, primal and fierce, rise within me. No, I thought, I cannot let this continue. I cannot turn away and leave him to suffer silently, to be forever tainted by that man's wickedness. Yet the word justice felt hollow here, tangled in my own guilt and fear. Justice, I realized, was something I had to forge myself in the shadowed corners of my conscience. My mind spun with the chaos of possibilities. If I act now, if I expose the truth, if I confront the monster, I risk everything, my reputation, my peace, perhaps even my soul. The church's sanctity, the reputation I held dear, all threatened to crumble beneath the weight of my decision. But in the depths of this turmoil, a strange sense of clarity emerged. The boy's suffering was a fire that could no longer be ignored. To stay silent would be a betrayal, a sin far greater than any I had committed before. The room grew darker, as if the shadows themselves recoiled from the impending storm. I felt the cold grip of fear clutching my chest, yet beneath it a flicker of resolve ignited. I knew what I must do. I must act, not impulsively but with conviction. I had to protect the innocent, even if it meant crossing lines no man should dare cross. I drew a deep breath, steadying myself against the tide of doubt. My hands, still trembling, clenched into fists once more. I imagined confronting the man again, forcing him to face his crimes with no escape. I envisioned myself stepping forward, voice firm and unwavering, demanding justice for the boy who deserved so much more than silence or shame. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was my sacred duty, that I could no longer hide behind the veneer of piety and denial. Yet, amid the chaos, a whisper of haunting doubt shadowed my thoughts. What if my actions unleashed a storm I could not control? What if in my quest for justice I only deepened the darkness? The line between hero and villain blurred, and I felt myself teetering on the edge of an abyss. The certainty I once had about my moral path was dissolving into a fog of uncertainty. Still, I knew deep within that I could not, would not, turn away now. The boy's innocence, his trust, had been shattered, and I was the only one who knew the truth. It was my burden to carry, and I had to decide whether to bear it quietly or to act. My choice would define me, whether I was a man of faith or simply a broken soul seeking redemption through bloody justice. As I sat there, grappling with my internal war, I felt a strange sense of peace mixed with dread. The decision had been made, even if only in my mind. I would confront the monster, whatever the cost. I would protect the boy, even if it meant risking everything I held dear. Justice, I realized, could only come through my own hand now. The shadows were closing in, and I prepared myself to step into the darkness, knowing full well that once I crossed that line, there was no returning to the light. The memory surged through me like a violent storm, tearing through the fragile walls I had built around my conscience. I can still see that dark night so vividly, the cold air biting into my skin as I moved through the shadows, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. I was a young man then, reckless in my certainty that I was doing right, that justice was something I could impose with my own hands. Little did I understand that those hands would carry a burden I would carry for the rest of my life. I remember the trembling in my palms as I approached him, a man who had betrayed not just trust, but innocence. The moment I decided I would confront him, I felt a strange surge of power and dread coalescing into a single, deadly purpose. We met in that abandoned alley, where silence seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by my ragged breathing. I saw the fear in his eyes, an echo of the terror he had inflicted, or had I seen my own reflection in his? I can't tell anymore. The act was swift, relentless. My fists, driven by a mixture of rage and morality, delivered a punishment I had no right to give. When it was over, I stood there trembling, blood on my hands, my mind racing. I knew I had crossed a line, one carved by my own sense of justice, yet no less unforgivable. The man crumpled to the ground, broken, and I fled into the night, my conscience a tumult of shame and relief. That night haunted me from the very depths of my soul. I tried to bury it deep, pretending it was a necessary evil, a moment in my life that had to be endured for the greater good. But every time I closed my eyes, that image re-emerged. His face contorted in pain, my own hands trembling as I realized the atrocity I had committed. I told myself I did it for the boy, for innocence, for a fractured sense of justice. Yet beneath that justification lay a darker truth. I had taken a life, and no act could ever erase the stain of that night. The years that followed, I convinced myself I had become a man of faith, seeking redemption through service and prayer, trying to drown out the echoes of that dark deed. But every so often, the memory resurfaced unbidden, like a ghost demanding acknowledgement. I would see that man's eyes, hear the sound of his broken voice, feel the weight of my own guilt pressing down on me. It was as if my soul bore the scars of that night, invisible but unbearably real, and yet I always knew I couldn't run from it. Not entirely. That crime, my crime, shaped me more profoundly than any sermons or piety ever could. It was a secret locked within, a dark core from which I drew both shame and a twisted sense of justification. Sometimes I wondered if I was a monster, cloaked in the robes of a priest, or just a man broken by his own failures, seeking solace in acts of violence that I convinced myself were righteous. The guilt grew heavier with each passing year, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. I would lie awake at night, hearing the distant echoes of the past, feeling the weight of my sins pressing on my chest. I knew that someday, somehow, I would have to face that darkness again, that the shadow of my past would catch up with me, no matter how much I tried to hide it behind prayers and sermons. That night, in the quiet solitude of my confessional, as I whispered my sins and sought forgiveness, I felt the ghost of that night beckoning me. The memory was alive within me, a constant reminder that the line between right and wrong is often blurred, and that sometimes, in the name of justice, I had become what I despised. But I also knew that confronting that darkness was inevitable, that if I wanted true redemption, I would have to accept the monster I had become. Now, standing at this precipice, I realize that my past has carved a path I cannot escape. The weight of my sins is heavy, yet within that weight lies the truth I must accept. I am both sinner and savior, villain and victim. And perhaps in owning that duality, I can find some measure of peace, though I know it will always come at a cost. The shadows remain, and I am destined to carry their weight, forever haunted by the night I took a life in the name of justice. I paused, my breath catching in my throat as I looked into Miguel's eyes. The confession had been a long time in coming, but now that the words slipped free, a strange mixture of relief and dread washed over me. My hands trembled, not from fear but from the weight of what I was about to reveal, something that had been festering inside me for years, something I had kept buried beneath layers of guilt and justifications. Miguel sat there, silent, waiting. His face was a canvas of shock and disbelief, but I saw past that facade. I saw the cracks in his resolve, the flicker of hope fighting to survive amidst the horror I was about to unleash. I clenched my fists, feeling my nails dig into my palms as I prepared to speak the truth that would change everything. I killed him, I finally whispered, my voice barely audible but trembling with every syllable. The man who confessed to abusing that child. I found him, I confronted him. He admitted everything, and I couldn't let him walk free. I saw no other way. My words hung in the air, thick with conviction and horror. I felt a shudder run through my body, as if the admission alone was tearing a part of me away. Miguel's eyes widened further, his mouth parting as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, he looked at me as if I'd just revealed a ghost, a darkness I had kept hidden in the deepest corners of my soul. I knew that look, disbelief, fear, maybe even a flicker of pity. But beneath that, I sensed a faint flicker of understanding, or perhaps the recognition that I had crossed a line no man should cross. As I stared into his eyes, I could feel my own logic unraveling. I had justified my actions. Wasn't I a man of God, a protector of the innocent? Yet in that moment, I wondered if I had become something else entirely. Had I become the monster I once feared? Or was I still the same man fighting a war he couldn't win? My mind raced back to that night, the cold, tense silence before I found him, the sickening realization as I saw the shame and guilt etched into his face. I remembered the way my heart had pounded, the violent urge to end it all, to erase the evil I believed was tainting the world. I remembered pulling the trigger, the deafening crack that echoed in my ears, and the immediate silence that followed. That act? Was it justice or was it revenge cloaked in righteousness? Now, as I sat across from Miguel, I saw him trembling, tears streaking down his face. His voice was choked when he finally managed to speak, begging me to see the mercy in his repentance. But mercy felt distant, distant as the horizon I could never reach after what I had done. I wanted to believe in redemption, to find some peace in the chaos of my conscience. Yet, I questioned whether true forgiveness was even possible for someone like me. "Do you understand?" I asked him softly, my voice strained. "Do you see what I've become? I sought justice, yes, but at what cost? I am haunted. I will always be haunted. That night changed me forever. I took a life in the name of righteousness, but in doing so I became something else, something darker." Miguel looked away, trembling, but I pressed on. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I only needed you to know the truth, because hiding it has been eating me alive. Every prayer, every confession was just a mask. Inside I knew I was no longer just a priest, no longer a protector. I was a killer." My voice cracked and I felt the surge of emotion threaten to break me apart. The silence between us stretched heavy and oppressive. I saw a flicker of hope in Miguel's eyes, perhaps the hope that redemption was still within reach, that salvation could be found even for a sinner such as I. But I knew better. I knew that some sins are too deep, too ingrained to wash away with words or prayers. I sat there feeling the cold truth settle into my bones. The act had been done. The guilt would never leave me. And yet somewhere within the chaos, a strange clarity emerged. I had owned my darkness. I had faced it finally, and acknowledged the monster I had kept hidden. Perhaps that was the only salvation left, to accept the shadow within rather than fight it. As I looked into Miguel's eyes one last time, I realized that the night's revelations had forged a new path for me, one paved with pain, truth, and the unyielding weight of my sins. I was both the executioner and the penitent, caught in a liminal space where forgiveness seemed an elusive dream. But I had spoken the truth, and in that confession I found a bitter, fragile form of freedom. As I sat there, the flickering candle casting trembling shadows across the cold stone wall, I hesitated just for a fraction of a second. My trembling hands clutched the worn fabric of my robes as I prepared to speak, to unveil the depths of the darkness I had buried for so long. The weight of what I was about to confess pressed down on me, suffocating almost, but I knew I had no choice. Silence was no longer an option. Silence was complicity. My voice broke as I finally admitted the abuse. It was worse than I thought. The words tasted bitter, like ash on my tongue. I looked directly at the boy's trembling frame, his eyes wide, brimming with a mixture of fear and cautious hope. But I couldn't turn away from what I knew I had witnessed, what I had failed to prevent. I revealed that the boy's pain extended far beyond what I'd initially uncovered. The stories he'd whispered in my ear, so fragile, so desperate, unraveled into a much darker narrative. It wasn't just a single incident. It was a tangled web of secrets woven tight within the church hierarchy, of figures I once trusted, of lies spun for the sake of preserving an image. I saw the betrayal in my own reflection, how I had been blind, complicit in allowing this nightmare to fester beneath the guise of sanctity. The room grew colder, But my voice steadied as I continued. There were others. Men I looked up to, men I believed were holy, who betrayed that trust, who used their authority to silence those who dared to speak out. I found evidence, secret messages, hidden photographs. It was a conspiracy of silence, designed to keep everything buried. My words cut through the air like shards of broken glass, each one a jagged reminder of the sins I had ignored. I felt the weight of a revelation I could no longer contain, that I myself had played a part, albeit unwillingly, in this web of corruption. I confessed to knowing, to seeing the signs, but doing nothing. The shame of my inaction clawed at my insides. I saw the shock ripple across the boy's face, but I pressed on, knowing that honesty was the only path left. A moment of silence stretched painfully between us. His trembling grew more pronounced as the reality sank in. I saw the flicker of anger, of betrayal, and perhaps even pity. But I knew that exposing this truth would shatter whatever innocence remained, yet remaining silent would stain my soul forever. The church, the sanctuary I had once believed in, now loomed as a monument of lies, an edifice built on secrets and blood. And then I realized I could no longer keep my own sins hidden. I had to face the consequence of my silence. My confession was a sacrilege. I had betrayed not only the boy, but also my vows, my integrity. There was no redemption left, only the stark necessity of bearing witness to the truth, no matter the cost. As I finished, I felt a strange calm settle inside me, a certainty that I had finally done what I couldn't do before. I had exposed the rot. It was a dangerous act, one that might condemn me to damnation, but it was also liberation. I had pulled back the curtain on the darkness that had festered beneath the sacred facade. In that moment, I understood that confronting these horrors was not about salvation, but about accepting the monstrous reality we had all allowed to grow in the shadows. I saw the boy's eyes fill with tears, and I knew that my confession would alter everything, our lives, our futures, perhaps even the church itself. And yet I felt an odd sense of relief, knowing that I had finally spoken the unspoken, that I had unmasked the monsters lurking behind the altar. The church's walls might never forgive me, nor might I forgive myself, but I had done what needed to be done. I had unveiled the truth, and in doing so I stepped into a new, darker reality, one where shadows no longer remained hidden, and where I would have to live with the consequences of my silence and my revelations. A tempest roared within me as I prepared to open my mouth again, my trembling hands clutching the cold wooden bench beneath me. The dim flicker of the candle cast elongated shadows across the stone walls, making the chamber feel like a prison of secrets I was finally breaking free from. My heart hammered so fiercely I feared it might burst, yet I knew that silence was no longer an option, not after what I had come to realize. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the chaos inside. My gaze fixed on the man sitting before me, his face pale and betrayed by the flickering light. His eyes, once confident and unyielding, now darted around as if seeking an escape, as if the very walls might swallow him whole. I saw the fear in his eyes, an emotion I had long buried beneath layers of guilt and shame, and it ignited a fierce fury within me. The words that spilled from my lips felt like knives slicing through my soul. I confessed, not just to the act I committed, but to the complicity that had shrouded me for so long. I told him how I knew, how I'd concealed his sin, how I had allowed the darkness to fester beneath my sacred vows. My voice trembled, yet carried with a dangerous resolve, each syllable peeling back the mask of righteousness I had worn for years. As I uttered the truth, a strange calm washed over me, an icy tranquility born from the act of unmasking the lie. I watched his face twist in horror, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of his own confession had finally crushed him. But I did not look away. I no longer cared for the consequences. My conscience demanded this reckoning. The betrayal of my faith felt like a dagger twisting in my heart, yet somehow this act of admitting my treachery was also a form of redemption. I had chosen to stop hiding behind the altar, to pull back the curtain on the monstrosity that had lurked in the shadows of the church's sacred facade. I had crossed a line, and I knew that the moment I had spoken the truth I had forever altered the course of my life. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I could hear my own ragged breathing as I awaited his response, perhaps anger, perhaps despair, perhaps something even darker. I realized then that my faith had been shattered long before this confession, broken into pieces by the weight of what I had concealed. Yet in this act of exposing the horror, I found a kind of twisted clarity. The Church's teachings, the vows I once held sacred, they all seemed distant now, replaced by the raw reality of human frailty and moral corruption. My mind raced with the implications. Would I be cast out, punished, or would there be some shred of mercy? The question felt hollow. Mercy wasn't what I sought anymore. What I needed was truth, raw, unfiltered, and brutal. For too long I had been complicit in secrecy, allowing evil to flourish under the guise of holiness. No longer. My hands clenched into fists as I looked into his eyes one last time. I saw the man I once thought I knew, now broken and trembling, his guilt etched into every line of his face. I felt no triumph, only a cold resolve. I knew that this act of confession would send shockwaves through the church, the community, perhaps even my own soul. And yet I could no longer live with the lie. In that moment I understood that I was no longer a priest bound by vows. I was a witness to the darkness we all preferred to ignore. I had stepped into the abyss, and though fear gnawed at my core, I was finally free. Free from the chains of silence, from the illusions of sanctity. I had chosen to confront the monstrous truth, knowing full well that it would forever change everything. As I prepared to leave that chamber, I felt the weight of my decision settle deep within me. My faith was shattered, yes, but some part of me felt lighter, liberated from the falsehoods I had upheld for so long. The path ahead was uncertain, cloaked in shadows and repercussions I could scarcely imagine. Yet I carried the truth like a torch, blazing through the darkness I had once helped nurture. Whatever came next, I knew I would never again retreat into silence. I had spoken. I had unmasked the evil, and somehow that made all the difference. The night stretched out in endless silence, thick and oppressive around me. I sat alone in my small, dimly lit room, the shadows dancing on the walls, mirroring the chaos inside my mind. Every breath I took felt like a betrayal to the part of me that desperately wanted peace. Yet I knew I could no longer carry the weight of my silence. The memories clawed at my consciousness, images I had tried to suppress for so long, but tonight they demanded to be acknowledged. My hands, once steady in moments of prayer, now trembled uncontrollably. I looked down at them, trembling as if they belonged to someone else, someone weaker. I had kept everything bottled up, every secret, every lie that had festered beneath the surface of my so-called sanctity. But tonight was different. Tonight I had reached a breaking point. The guilt had become a suffocating force, pressing down on me until I thought I would drown in it. The confession burned inside me, a relentless ache that refused to be ignored. I knew I could no longer deny the truth that had clawed its way out of the depths of my soul. I was responsible for the darkness that had stained this church, for the silence that had allowed evil to flourish. And as the shame threatened to crush me, I saw no other choice but to confront it directly. With trembling fingers, I reached for my worn-out cross, clutching it tightly as if it could somehow absolve me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the words refused to come at first. They lingered on my tongue, heavy and unwelcome. When I finally managed to speak, my voice cracked, hollow against the silence. I have to tell you the truth. It spilled out in fragments, confession, remorse, and the terrible realization that I had been complicit in something far worse than I had ever admitted aloud. I confessed to the unthinkable, to the darkness I had hidden, to the terrible secrets I had kept from everyone, even myself. My voice quivered and faltered, yet I pressed on, driven by a force I could no longer resist. And then, as if the words had unlocked a dam, I admitted what I had kept buried deep inside. I killed him. I saw the shock ripple across my reflection in the mirror, the horror reflected back at me. The weight of that phrase crushed my chest, but a strange relief followed, an unanticipated release from the chains of guilt that had bound me for so long. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of loss and liberation intertwined. My hands, sweaty and trembling, clenched into fists as I acknowledged the consequences of my decision. I knew I was crossing a line, that I was stepping into a darkness from which I could not return. The guilt had eaten away at me, gnawing at my conscience. But this act of confession, this act of absolution, was my attempt at redemption, or perhaps my final surrender. My mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of what I had just done. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. I questioned if I had made the right choice, if there was any hope left for me to find peace after what I had revealed. Yet, despite the chaos swirling inside, I felt a strange calm, an acceptance born from knowing I had finally broken free from my self-imposed prison. I realized that I could not undo what had been done. The truth was out, irrevocable and raw. I knew the repercussions would be swift and unforgiving. My reputation, my faith, my very soul, everything could be shattered by this confession. But I also knew that the lie had become worse than any punishment I could endure. The silence, the cover-up, the denial, all of it had to end. As I sat there, clutching my hands to my chest, I understood that I was no longer a man of the cloth, bound by vows of silence. I was simply a man, broken, flawed, and utterly exposed. My decision was irrevocable. I had unveiled the darkness, not just for myself, but for anyone willing to confront the truth. No matter what lay ahead, I knew I could no longer pretend. The night's stillness was my witness, and I would carry the burden of this secret forever, or until the end of my days. A surge of something I can't quite name overtook me, a force ancient and relentless. It was as if a part of me had been waiting, buried beneath layers of guilt and remorse, and now it erupted with a ferocity I could no longer control. My hands trembled violently, gripping the cold earth beneath me as I grasped the shovel. The weight of it felt impossible to lift, yet I forced myself to dig, driven by a dark impulse that seemed to originate from the depths of my soul. Each shovelful of dirt was a step further into my own abyss. The earth accepted my burdens silently, indifferent to my suffering. I felt the sweat trickle down my forehead, the muscles in my arms burning with the effort. But I kept digging, driven by an instinct that felt both primal and divine. The faint moonlight cast sinister shadows across the scene, transforming the garden into a graveyard of my conscience. The moment I unearthed Miguel's body, I was struck by a visceral wave of revulsion. His face, so peaceful in death, haunted me. I could see the innocence that I had shattered, the trust I had betrayed. My mind spun with images of his last moments, the innocence lost, the trust broken. It was as if I was watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion, yet I couldn't look away. Without hesitation, I grasped the cold, trembling form of Miguel and dragged him into the hole I had just prepared. My heart pounded so loudly I feared it might burst, but I pushed the thought aside. This act was no longer about guilt or morality. It was about erasing the stain that had tainted my soul. The dirt covered him completely now, and I scrambled to fill the grave, shoving the earth down with desperate, frantic strokes. A strange calm settled over me as the last clumps of soil were pressed into place. I stared at the mound, feeling both repulsion and a sick sense of relief. I had done it, what I thought I could never do. The darkness that had been lurking inside me for years had finally found its outlet, and I had embraced it fully. The act felt like an exorcism, a purge of the demons that haunted my conscience, but beneath that calm a fierce, gnawing terror lurked. I knew with icy certainty that I had crossed a line from which there was no return. The weight of what I had just committed pressed down on my chest, suffocating me. Every fiber of my being screamed in protest, yet I stood there, rooted to the earth, trembling with an exhaustion that was more than physical. In the aftermath, a cold, hollow silence enveloped me. I felt the entirety of my life collapsing into this singular moment, an irreversible act that would define me forever. The act of taking a life, of silencing another's breath, had transformed my soul into something unrecognizable. I wondered if I could ever wash away this stain, if redemption was even possible now. As I looked down at my trembling hands, I could see the dirt smudged beneath my nails, the same dirt that now concealed Miguel's body. I knew I would carry this burden to my grave, a secret that would haunt me until the end of my days. The night felt colder, darker, as if the universe itself mourned what I had done. I was no longer a priest. I was a man damned by his own actions, forever marked by the darkness I had unleashed, and yet even in this moment of profound devastation, a flicker of defiance remained. I had faced the unthinkable and acted. Perhaps that was my penance, or perhaps a warning to myself that some sins can never be forgiven. But I knew one thing for certain. I had sealed my fate, and in doing so, I had become something far more terrible than I had ever imagined I could be. My soul, once a vessel of faith, was now a battlefield of shadows, and I wondered in the depths of my fractured mind if I would ever find a way back from this darkness, The echoes of my deed persist like ghostly whispers in the hollow chambers of my mind, each reverberation a cruel reminder of what I have become. I sit alone in the dim solitude of the confessional, my palms sweaty and trembling, clutching at the cold wood as if it might somehow anchor me against the storm raging within. My voice, once steady and imbued with divine authority, now quivers as I confess the unthinkable, my hand the instrument of death, inextricably entwined with my soul's descent into darkness. The words spill out, reluctant but unavoidable. I speak of the moment I ended Miguel's life, the boy whose innocence I had sworn to protect. The memory assaults me anew, sharper than before. How his eyes flickered with a flicker of hope even as I tightened my grip, how his tiny voice, pleading, faded into silence. I remember the sensation of my own hands around his fragile neck, an act I never imagined I was capable of. Yet now here I lay bare my guilt with an unflinching honesty. As I confess, I notice a flicker of something in the man across from me. Horror, yes, but also a strange understanding, as if he recognizes the depths of my despair. I see his eyes widen further, not with judgment, but with a silent acknowledgement that I have crossed a line from which there is no return. I feel the weight of his gaze pressing into my soul, piercing through the veneer of clerical composure I desperately clutch to. In that confession, a strange sense of calm washes over me, an eerie calm that prickles beneath my skin. The act of unburdening myself releases a heavy, shattering weight, yet leaves behind a hollow ache that threatens to swallow me whole. The truth has seeped out like poison, flowing from my lips and spilling into the sacred space of the confessional, hollowing out the very core of my faith and morality. I wonder, in that quiet darkness, whether I have truly saved anyone or damned myself further. Did I act out of mercy, an attempt to end Miguel's suffering, or out of some twisted sense of justice that now feels hollow and meaningless? I am haunted by the memory of the boy's trembling body, by the soundless plea that went unheard. Was my decision an act of salvation or a descent into pure evil? I cannot tell anymore. The silence that follows my confession is deafening. I am acutely aware that I have sealed my fate, that I have irrevocably become something else, something darker than I ever dared to admit. The divine words that once flowed from my mouth are now replaced by a suffocating silence. My soul feels fractured, torn between remorse and relief, caught in a limbo of profound despair. In that moment, I grasp desperately at a shred of rationality, questioning whether redemption is still within reach, or if I am forever condemned to wander through an unending night. The darkness within me grows thicker, more suffocating, as I realize I have crossed a boundary from which there is no return. I am no longer just a priest. I am a man haunted by his own shadows, a soul scarred by acts that defy forgiveness. My mind spirals trying to reconcile the man I was with the man I have become. I search for meaning, any meaning behind the chaos of my actions. Did I do what was necessary? Was there any other way? My heart aches with the weight of unanswered questions, each one pressing down on me like a stone. And yet amidst this chaos, a strange flicker of defiance flickers within. I fought to speak the truth, knowing full well it would shatter my world. Perhaps that is my penance, that I have faced the monstrous in myself and refused to deny it. Or perhaps it is a warning, a grim reminder that some sins are beyond redemption, forever etched into the fabric of my existence. As I rise from the confessional, I feel an icy chill seep into my bones, a prelude to the endless night I now inhabit. The boundaries of my faith are blurred, my conscience fractured, and I am left to wander this new reality, an unholy testament to the darkness I have unleashed. I carry the burden of Miguel's death, and I do so knowing that my soul may never find peace, that I am forever changed, stained by the shadows I once thought I could dispel. In this silence, I hear the distant echoing reverberations of my own despair, and I realize with bleak clarity that some acts irrevocably shatter the sanctity of the soul, and I, perhaps, have shattered mine beyond repair. I took a deep breath, the air thick and suffocating, as I lowered myself into the cold, unforgiving chair of the police station. My palms were clammy, trembling with the weight of what I was about to do. Every movement felt like a betrayal of everything I had once believed in, yet I knew I could no longer carry the burden in silence. My voice faltered at first, but I steadied it, knowing that silence would condemn me more than any confession. With a voice cracked and strained, I began to speak. I told them everything. The nights I'd kept hidden, the whispers I'd ignored, the icy grip of rage that had seized me when I saw that man slip away after confessing his sins. I explained how I'd watched his face distort with guilt, how I'd seen the shame in his eyes. And then, in a moment I can't entirely explain, my hand moved almost involuntarily. Without fully understanding why, I revealed the truth I'd buried deep, how I had taken justice into my own hands. The words spilled out, each sentence a heavy stone dropped into still waters. I described how I had followed him, how my patience had worn thin, how the shame and anger had fused into a singular, deadly resolve. I told them about the confrontation that spiraled out of control, about my fists that struck when he was most vulnerable, about the final blow that ended a life I now see as a twisted act of salvation and damnation intertwined. I watched their eyes widen, some in disbelief, others in quiet horror, as I unraveled my soul in front of them. There was no remorse in my voice, only a hollow relief, an acknowledgement of the monster I'd become. I explained that I believed I was acting out of justice, out of a desperate attempt to shield the innocent from future harm. I argued that perhaps I'd been led astray by my own sense of righteousness, blinded by the horrors I'd witnessed and the corruption I could no longer bear to ignore. I sought to justify my violence, to rationalize the chaos I had unleashed. My words were raw and unfiltered, a confession not just of my deed but of my fractured spirit. As I sat there, trembling still, I could feel the cold steel of their gaze piercing through me. I knew I was no longer a man of the cloth, only a broken soul stained and shattered beyond repair. The room seemed to close in, the walls echoing with the silence of my own guilt. I pictured the boy's innocent face, the innocence I had tried to protect but failed, and I felt an unbearable ache, a sense that I had crossed a line from which there was no redemption. When they finally asked me why I did it, I looked down, unable to meet their eyes. I spoke softly, almost whispering, as if confessing a forbidden prayer. I told them I had acted out of a desperate, primal need to restore some semblance of justice, a justice I believed I could no longer trust in the world outside these walls. I admitted that the shadows within me had grown too dark to be contained, that I had become both judge and executioner, haunted by the ghost of my own moral failing. The room grew silent again, each of us drowning in the weight of what I'd revealed. I saw the flicker of judgment, of pity, and perhaps a hint of understanding. But I knew that no matter what they thought, I had already lost my soul, if it was ever truly mine to begin with. I had severed the last thin thread holding me to my former faith, and in doing so, I had embraced a new, darker reality, one where justice and vengeance blurred into a single, unrecognizable form. As they led me away, I carried this truth like a shroud around my shoulders. I felt the cold steel of the handcuffs bite into my wrists, a cruel reminder of my inevitable descent into darkness. I wondered if I would ever find peace, or if I was doomed to wander forever in the shadows of my own making. My mind replayed that moment of reckless violence, seared into my memory like a scar that will never fade. In this moment of surrender, I realized something chilling. I had become what I despised, what I feared, what I had once believed I could resist. Now I was just a man broken, a soul lost in the depths of its own despair. The act had been impulsive yet deliberate, a final act of defiance against the world that had betrayed me. And as I looked into the eyes of those who judged me, I knew that my journey into darkness was only just beginning. As I sit in the cold courtroom, the air thick with anticipation and unspoken judgments, I feel my pulse racing beneath my skin. My hands rest limply on the wooden surface before me, trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what I've already admitted. The room seems to close in, each observer's gaze pressing down like a heavy stone, and I can't help but reflect on the path that led me here, a labyrinth of guilt, faith shattered, and a desperate search for some form of redemption. I see the judge's eyes flickering with disapproval, the prosecutor's gaze sharp with conviction, but all I can focus on is my own trembling voice, echoing through the silence. I remember the moment I chose to speak, to unburden myself of the secret that had haunted me for years. It was as if releasing that confession had fractured something inside, a fragile piece of my soul finally breaking free from its prison. Yet instead of relief, I felt a strange calm settle, a calm born from surrender, from accepting the darkness I had unleashed. My mind drifts back to the day I confronted the man. I recall how the shadows within me had already begun to stir long before that day. The whispers of rage, the urge for retribution, had grown into a roaring tempest I could no longer contain. When I finally found him, the words came out cold, deliberate, as if I was speaking someone else's act of justice. I saw the shock in his eyes, the disbelief that I, a man of faith, could commit such an act. But I knew my actions were not driven solely by anger. They were fueled by a long-standing betrayal, a loss of innocence that I could no longer ignore. As I sit here now, I realize that my confession is more than a mere admission. It's a testament to how far I've fallen. I tried to justify it in my mind at the time, believing that the man deserved whatever punishment I dealt him, but deep down, I knew I had crossed a line that no penance could ever mend. Part of me had always suspected that my sense of justice was corrupted by my own shadows, but I refused to see it until the moment I could no longer deny it. The courtroom's silence is deafening, yet I feel a strange clarity. I am painfully aware of how my actions have torn apart the fragile fabric of my faith. I was supposed to be a shepherd, guiding others toward salvation, yet I became a vessel of destruction myself. The irony is bitter. I had sought righteousness, only to find myself consumed by the very darkness I despised. I questioned whether redemption was still within reach, or if I had irrevocably lost my soul, a question I asked myself every waking moment. My thoughts are interrupted by the prosecutor's voice, sharp and relentless, accusing me of moral depravity. I meet his gaze and see the certainty in his eyes, a mirror of my own conviction, yet so different in purpose. I want to scream, to defend myself, but words fail me. Instead, I sit quietly, trying to summon the strength to accept whatever punishment awaits. I have already faced the consequences in my mind countless times. Now I only wonder if the court can comprehend the storm raging inside me. I recall the nights I spent wrestling with guilt, the prayers that felt increasingly hollow, and the moments I questioned whether I had ever truly believed. My faith, which once held me upright, now feels like a distant memory replaced by a gnawing emptiness. I had clung to the hope of redemption, but with each confession, I realize how much I've drifted from that path. Would forgiveness ever find me? Or am I destined to remain lost in this darkness, forever at odds with the man I once was? In this moment, I grasp at a fragile thread of hope, a hope that perhaps somewhere deep within the shadows of my soul, there is still a spark that can ignite change. I don't know if I believe in divine mercy anymore, but I cling to the possibility that even in my broken state, I might find a way to be redeemed, not through the court's verdict, but within myself. Still, I cannot deny the chilling truth. I am no longer the man I once aspired to be. I am merely a mirror of my own despair, a testament to the destructive power of secrets kept too long. As the judge prepares to deliver the verdict, I feel the weight of my choices settle heavier than ever. My mind races through the countless threads of my past, moments of weakness, flashes of clarity, the betrayal of my own conscience. I am painfully aware that my actions have irrevocably altered the course of my life. Whether that course leads to penance or eternal damnation, I cannot say. All I know is that I have embraced the darkness fully, and now I must face the consequences of my own making. The gavel strikes, piercing the heavy silence like a final blow. And in that instant I understand that my journey is only just beginning, whether toward redemption or ruin. I am haunted not just by the crime I committed, but by the realization that I have become the very monster I once vowed to oppose. The courtroom fades away, replaced by the relentless echo of my own remorse. I am left to grapple with the truth that sometimes the greatest punishment is simply living with the knowledge of what I have done, and daring to ask if forgiveness can ever truly be mine.